Join us for another exciting episode at the home of spine-tingling research, the Knowledge Hub. Welcome to this episode of the Knowledge Hub, the podcast dedicated to bringing spine-tingling academic research out of the ivory tower and into the marketplace, and making it accessible and visible not only to fellow academics, but also to the broader public. We aim to bridge the gap between scholarly work and real-world impact by drawing academics into conversations in society and the marketplace. Today we have the privilege to talk to Professor Dion Rousseau. Hello, Dion.
Hello.
Now, Dion, you've spent nearly 4 decades shaping how we think about ethics in business and governance. But let's start at the beginning, and that's your early foundation. So can you tell us about your upbringing and what initially drew you to philosophy and ethics, and the particular experiences or influences in your early life that sparked this interest?
Yeah, well, I grew up in a rural town by the name of Vredendal in the Western Cape, almost Northern Cape. I was a first-generation university student, so the whole world of academia was new and exciting to me. And I initially enrolled for theology, so I started with my undergraduate degree, where most of your subjects are prescribed, and you can only select 1 or 2 subjects. I had a roommate who I met there for the first time. His father was a very well-known politician with a doctorate in law, and he told me that his father told him that he can take whatever subject he wishes to take as long as he includes philosophy. So I decided that it sounds like good advice to me. I had no idea what philosophy was all about as a subject. But the moment that I ventured into philosophy, I was fascinated by it. And that very well-known saying of Socrates of the unexamined life is not worth living is something that really stuck with me. And I think once you've discovered that reflective way of life, it is impossible to turn around and go back to your old ways. What drew me specifically to the field of ethics was that my supervisor in both my master's and doctoral dissertation was academic Professor Willie Estraser, who was quite involved in writing about the politics of the day, publishing books like The End of Apartheid, The Road to Reform, but also one of the first persons to start writing, more in a popular manner, about ethics in business. And it's the combination of these things that ultimately ignited that interest also in my professional career in business ethics, although my doctorate wasn't in business ethics at all.
Well, so it seems you've got actually a quite interdisciplinary foundation, but you also, during your student years, you excelled in student leadership. What was happening there, and how did that contribute to your development?
Yeah, it was an exciting time. It was mid-1980s, and the apartheid state was starting to crumble. And given the fact that I was chair of the Student Representative Council, it put me in contact with SRCs on other campuses. And I really started to understand what apartheid was and what it did to people. And through interesting and courageous conversations that we had with student leaders from other campuses, that whole glimpse of a new post-apartheid South Africa and the inclusive society started to emerge. But as you say, my interest was also quite interdisciplinary. Also the field of business ethics is not an academic discipline. It's an interdisciplinary field where you need to speak more than one disciplinary language, and also methodologically you need to be quite flexible, to put it softly. So my initial interest was in psychology, philosophy, and theology. Later in my career, I had the opportunity to spend a sabbatical at Cambridge University. And there, this was really much deeper reinforced, because at Cambridge, I discovered that people deliberately walk across boundaries in order to renew their own subjects. And I was working with the economist then, who was studying quantum physics and theology at the same time. Also had a good relationship with an accountant who was reading Foucault and other French philosophers. And it was just fascinating to see what's the impact of this interdisciplinary work on their own academic output. Because I think we all know that innovation seldom happens at the core, but it normally happens at the periphery. And that is why up to today I'm very big supporter of interdisciplinary research.
I think the ivory tower can very easily become an ivory silo, and you are into a kind of an echo chamber.
Absolutely.
So it seems to me what you did, you had an interdisciplinary theoretical basis, but also a very practical real-world experience through student involvement and so on. And that is what formed you, that foundational work and so on. So let's talk about your academic career and your scholarly development. So after completing your PhD in philosophy in 1989, you started at the then Rand Afrikaans University. So tell us about that part of your academic career.
Yeah, I actually started a few years earlier because I completed my doctorate while I was already teaching there. So my doctorate focused on the interaction between what we would normally call exclusive ideologies, and specifically the interaction between Christianity and Marxism. That was what fascinated me. And for my doctoral study, I looked at what are the conditions that need to be in place for these exclusive ideologies to start interacting, at least talking, but ultimately also collaborating. And I found that very fascinating, and my immediate urge was to continue with that after I completed my doctoral dissertation. But then gradually I also became interested in business ethics, especially once again through interdisciplinary contacts that I had with people in business management and in the law faculty and in the accounting departments. And I got drawn into teaching business ethics, which ultimately then also resulted in research on business ethics. A third contender at the time was also my frustration with students' ability to think and write properly. And in the end, each of these interests led to a book publication. So post my doctoral dissertation, I wrote a more popular book called Christian Marxist and Socialist in the New South Africa. So that was sort of a continuation of my doctoral theme. I also published a book called Skillful Thinking with my colleagues in the philosophy department, and I published Business Ethics, a Southern African Perspective as well. But in the end, it was the business ethics that won and gained the upper hand, and in my further career, the focus was initially more on business ethics, and then gradually over time to the interface between business ethics and corporate governance. So I focused more and more on that ethical dimension of corporate governance, and coined a distinction that is now being used the world over between the ethics of corporate governance, which is about the foundations, the ethical underpinnings of corporate governance systems, and the corporate governance of ethics, which is about what boards typically would do regarding the ethics of the organizations that they govern. So yeah, that became the main focus of my academic career.
Now that's very interesting, because reality is so complex, and every vantage point highlights a certain aspect of it, but is totally blind to another one. So it's very interesting to hear that you actually try to bring kind of almost opposing views on reality, like Marxism and Christianity, to talk to each other. And then the whole thing about ethics that's just amazing, because once again, it's an interdisciplinary field, but it's with its feet firmly grounded into reality.
Absolutely. If you look at Marx, he insisted in his famous saying, he said, philosophers until now only interpreted the world in so many ways. The point is to change it. And also his whole view of praxis, where he says it is about developing theory that will change the world. So that impetus also from Marxism ironically inspired my interest in the ethics of capitalism. But then once again to practice it in a way that changed the world and not do armchair philosophy or armchair moral speculations, but really to bring it to the point where people who govern organizations and to manage organizations find it palatable and in a way that they can use and apply it.
Before we continue, let me tell you about a journal that's rethinking what academic publishing can be. The Journal of Exotechnology and Education, or JEXT in short, isn't your typical academic journal. This open access, peer-reviewed publication welcomes not just traditional articles, but also videos, games, podcasts, apps, animations, and even works in progress. If you are researching cutting-edge technology in education and want to show your work in motion rather than just describe it, this is your platform. And here's the best part. While we are awaiting accreditation, there are no page fees. All content is freely available under Creative Commons licensing, so your research reaches everyone who needs it. Ready to publish something truly innovative? Email Erna at olivee@unisa.ac.za. That is olivee@unisa.ac.za, or visit their website to learn more. And that's JEXT, where educational technology research breaks free from static pages. You also had impressive international exposure and worked the world over. Can you tell us what that was and how did that contribute to your current interest and so on?
Yeah, I was very fortunate to have a number of sabbaticals, which I think is the biggest benefit of being an academic, so that every 7th year you can go on a larger project. I spent my first sabbatical in Minnesota at an ecumenical institute at the University of St. John's, right up there in the north of Minnesota. And that is where I first really ventured into the field of business ethics. And then my second sabbatical was at Cambridge, at the Judge Institute for Business Management there. And that led to a publication called Developing Business Ethics as an Academic Field. So I was looking at how business ethics evolved, first in the US and later in Europe and then in other parts of the world, and what can be learned regarding how to institutionalize business ethics as an academic field, obviously in higher education. My third sabbatical was a very interesting one at a foundation in Geneva called Globe Ethics. And as you can hear from the word, the whole idea was to do ethics on a global scale. And there I was very fortunate to work on a project that really formed the culmination of my academic career, which was a global survey of business ethics, where we divided the world into 9 regions, appointed 9 research teams consisting in total of about 70 researchers from around the world, and where we were really able to map every country on the face of our globe in terms of what is happening there as far as teaching, training, and research in business ethics, and what publications have been published. Also putting one in a position to also see differences in different parts of the world, but of course also the commonalities. And that led to another book publication called The Global Survey of Business Ethics as Field of Teaching, Training and Research. And soon after the completion of that project, I left academia full-time and started venturing elsewhere.
Well, this international and broader perspective must have been extremely enriching, but you consistently emphasizes a Southern African perspective. Now, is ethics in Africa different from ethics in the world?
Well, on the one hand, you can say that ethics is ethics wherever you are. But of course, when it comes to what are the issues in specific parts of the world, it's very different. You can just imagine if you compare, say, Europe to the Americas, to Africa with its colonial history, South Africa with its apartheid legacy, a unique value system in Africa, the Ubuntu philosophy that we get. It is impossible, and I think it's unwise to try to solve the problems of the global north while you are situated in the global south. And that's why I initially started emphasizing the South African, later the Southern African, and later on the African perspective. So, and it was all triggered by a conference that I attended in 1996 in Japan, the first World Congress of the International Society of Business Economics and Ethics. And I was asked there to contribute to what they called a worldwide survey of business ethics on what is happening in Africa. And I had no clue what is happening in the field in Africa. So I said, well, the only thing that I can tell you is what is happening in South Africa, because I have a sense of how the field started to develop here. It was still in its infancy at the time. But that experience really triggered my interest, first of all, what is happening on the rest of this continent, and how does it relate to what happens in the rest of the world? So it is from that background that I got a specific interest in what is different on the African continent, what are the unique issues that are triggered by a legacy of apartheid and colonialism, but also from a unique value system. And that really contributed to that focus in my work.
Now, it seems to me you were building the field and you founded the Business Ethics Network of Africa, and so you also started a journal in that field. And so can you tell us what that entailed, and a little bit more, but what did you find ethically wise and business ethically wise in Africa? What is going on here, and how does it compare to the world, and is it different or the same?
Yeah. Yes, I was the founding president of the Business Ethics Network of Africa. We call it BEN Africa for short. And it was through my experiences in that International Society of Business Economics and Ethics that I became aware that in other parts of the world there are well-structured networks. For example, in the United States, you had the Society of Business Ethics. You had something similar in Latin America. In Europe, you had EBEN, the European Business Ethics Network. In Japan, you had the Japan Business Ethics Society. And I just realized that we need something here. We need a network if we really want to stimulate the development of the field. And it was quite interesting when we started BEN Africa. at more or less that time, one of my students did a survey of business ethics in Africa and found activities in only 4 African countries. So it was us here in South Africa, and then there was in Egypt and 2 other countries. There were some teaching or some research going on. So we founded Ben Africa in 2000, and then about 7 years later, I wasn't president at the time, but still quite involved with the organization, having strong parental feelings about the organization, who's now a quarter of a century old already. But that African Journal of Business Ethics, which we founded in Ben Africa, really had the focus of stimulating research, but also developing the quality of research. Because through the surveys that we've done, we realized that we are behind what is happening in other countries. And therefore, the African Journal of Business Ethics always had a very strong developmental agenda. And instead of just rejecting papers, we would reject a paper, but also provide some mentoring and see if over time we can develop a paper up to the point where it is a respectable paper that can be published in an academic journal. So in that sense, it played an important role. The journal is still ongoing. And I think in terms of what you ask about unique perspectives that we uncovered, the one theme that really resonated with me was a much more inclusive approach to corporate governance. You would know if you go to the US, it's a shareholder priority dispensation. In other words, you take decisions in the best interest of the shareholder, which I think is alien within the African context, where we take decisions in a way that we consider not only shareholders, but also all other stakeholders of the organization. And that really became an impetus to, I think, very important research that was also taken note of in the rest of the world. And the whole idea nowadays of an inclusive approach to corporate governance, where you govern organizations in the best interest of the company and not the best interest of the shareholders, is really an idea that caught on. And even in the US, we are hearing sounds now that it is time to change.
Well, that just shows how contact actually broadens perspective.
Yeah.
Well, and then you started to institutionalizing ethics in organizations.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about your current focus into organizations and how you support organizations to be ethical?
Yeah. Well, in 2010, I left academia full time. I was still had some part-time small responsibilities in academia, but I became CEO of the Ethics Institute. And the whole purpose of the Ethics Institute is to help organizations to build ethical cultures. And for that purpose, I think the academic background helped in terms of developing a framework, a well-founded academic framework where we say what we want to do is to build an ethical culture, but the ethical culture is the outcome of other things that you do. And that framework consists of, first of all, focusing on leadership commitment to ethics, to get that right tone from the top. Then the second element is to focus on your governance structures, your board of directors and your board committees, and their role in setting strategy and exercising oversight also of ethics in organizations. But then the third component is that someone should take the responsibility for managing ethics in organizations. And in that regard, the Ethics Institute, even before my time there, started a program called the Ethics Officer Certification Program that is accredited by one of our universities here in South Africa. And we are now running, as we sit here, the 172nd version of that program, having trained more than almost 3,000 people to become ethics officers not here in South Africa, but from about 30 different countries around the world. But the third component is that someone should manage ethics in your organization in the sense of conducting an ethics risk assessment, developing a strategy, getting your standards in place, and then make sure that people are familiar with those standards, motivated to follow the standards, and then you can report something back to your governance structures. In South Africa, typically your social and ethics committee. And then the fourth component is that from time to time there should be an independent assessment of the adequacy and effectiveness of whatever you are doing in the governance and management of ethics. But all this should be done in a manner that contribute to that outcome of an ethical culture. And the unique position that we were in and still are in at the Ethics Institute, if you start talking to researchers in the field of business ethics, they always complain about access. How do we get access to an organization where we can experiment and research? Because organizations are fairly close. They don't like to invite academics in always. But we were in the unique position that we were invited by organizations to do exactly that. That opened a wealth of information and ultimately knowledge for us in that field. And as I say, I think we were just very fortunate that it wasn't only an academic exercise, but that we really work with organizations on a day-to-day basis. We do ethics risk assessments for them. We do assessments on the maturity of the ethical culture. And we just gain more and more information and knowledge as we go on.
Yeah, well, that's actually fascinating to hear because, the layperson might think, business is the only thing they are after is to make as much money as possible and in any which way possible. And it seems to me this is now not necessarily the case. Now, you were also involved in a lot of reports, especially the King reports on corporate governance.
Yeah.
Okay, what is the King reports? What are they? And can you tell us about your involvement there?
Yeah, the King Report is an outcome of the King Commission, named after Judge Mervyn King, who was approached by Mandela in 1992 to establish this first King Committee to provide guidelines for how organizations should be governed. The King Reports are deliberately best practice standards and best practice principles for governing organizations. So it focuses on the board level, in other words, on the governance level, and it says these are the things that the governing body or the board of directors should typically do in order to ensure that the organization fulfill the purpose for which it was created. And I'm also a member of the King Committee now for quite a number of years already. But my involvement with the King Reports really came around the second King Report, which was published around 2002. And there was a very interesting element in the first King Report. There was a chapter on ethics, but it was the last chapter, just before the conclusion. So it was a bit of an afterthought in King 1. The other thing that was quite unique about King 1 is that it had a model code of ethics. And the whole idea was that companies were supposed to develop similar codes. But what happened between King 1, that was published in 1994, and King 2 in 2002, is that almost no companies developed their own codes. They just said, we abide by the King 1 model code. And then the authors of King 2 approached me and asked whether I would just do an update of the model code. And I very strongly advised against that. And I said, the reason why we should not have an update is that pattern of companies just doing a knee-jerk and say we subscribe to the King model code of ethics, is we should stop that practice. And we should try rather to encourage companies to develop their own unique codes of conduct. And you would see in King 2, there's an annexure at the end, which I wrote, which is about how to develop a code of ethics. And after King 2, we really saw the proliferation of codes of ethics. Nowadays, you can go to just about any company, and especially your larger and listed companies. And all of them have their own unique codes of ethics. So it took that knee-jerk out. But in a similar manner, I was involved in King 2, I also contributed to specifically the ethics dimensions of the third King report in 2009, the fourth one in 2016, and in a matter of days we will launch King 5. But there I was part of not only the ethics dimension, but the entire code. So it has been a very interesting journey, and the King reports are widely influential around the world. They are considered to be amongst the best. And when ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, developed their own governance standard, they used, besides the UK code, the King Code as the basis document for international standard on corporate governance. So I think the work that we have done here on the southern point of Africa did have quite a global impact, and to a large extent also thanks to the role that Mervyn King is playing, not only here but also internationally, in heading up the Global Reporting Initiative at one stage, the International Integrated Reporting Council, and also other bodies.
Well, this whole podcast series that we've got is to bring scholarly work into the society, and it seems to me exactly that's what you're doing, because with the King reports, also your ethics handbook series and your articles, so to make it accessible, just talk us through the whole ethics handbook series and also some of your articles. Which of those articles do you think had the biggest impact on society and real world?
Let's start with the Ethics Handbook series. Soon after I started at the Ethics Institute, we saw the introduction through changes through our new Companies Act of the introduction of social and ethics committees. And what it basically did, it made it a statutory requirement for certain categories of companies, like, for example, listed companies and state-owned companies, but also so-called public interest companies, to have a committee of the board called the Social and Ethics Committee. And it caused a lot of confusion initially. People were very confused about, so what's the role of this committee in relation to, say, the Risk Committee or the Audit Committee or Human Capital Committee? And then I decided to write this handbook called the Social and Ethics Committee Handbook, which was a practical guide for members of those committees, but also for management who need to report to those committees. And it was very well received. It was it was endorsed also by the Institute of Directors. And then the idea started, but why don't we build this out into an entire book series aimed at practitioners? It's not academic at all, so you leave the academic jargon as far as possible behind, and you talk in a language that almost want to say normal people can understand. And then we used that governance of ethics framework that I spoke about earlier, and used every dimension of that framework to write a handbook on leadership commitment, on the role of your governance structures, on the ethics management function, on conducting an ethics risk assessment, right up to how do you develop an ethical culture, but also assess the maturity of that ethical culture. So in that sense, it really is a very valuable resource. We make it available for free. There's no cost to it. It can be downloaded, and we track the downloading at the Ethics Institute, and we can see also from which countries people are using it. And it's really used right around the world, from Mexico to Spain to the UK, you name a country, and someone would have downloaded one of those books. In terms of my own work, you ask what had the biggest impact. Probably the work that I did around the ethics of governance, looking at the philosophical underpinnings of different corporate governance systems, but also on the more practical side, what does it mean for a board of directors to take responsibility for the ethics of that organization? In other words, what does the governance of ethics entails?
Well, academia is notorious of academics writing an article and spending an inordinate amount of time in it, and then they publish it in an article, and 4 people read that. So it seems to be, it needs to be more widely disseminated, and that's why we will also include a link to what you wrote and all your publications so that people can follow that up. Now let's talk about the state of business ethics and future directions in South Africa. You know, I think we are going through a phase of that leaves you kind of dejected about ethics in business. Now let's start with businesses in South Africa. Do you really think they are ethical?
There's never a blanket answer to a question like that that covers everybody. Of course, there are quite a number of businesses who realize that their competitive advantage lies in their ethics, and they would defend their ethics jealously. The CEO of one of our big banks is on record for saying, as a bank, we don't trade in money, we trade in trust. And nobody trusts you if you don't have ethics. So you have that kind of commitment. Obviously, there's a very long list of companies who failed. But the interesting thing about companies who failed is that they have become some of our best clients when I was still at the Ethics Institute. Because if you have been through a scandal, the one thing that you promise yourself is not to end up there again ever in your life. And therefore we have walked very long journeys with companies who failed and then say we don't want to go there again. I think something that also had a big impact that I see on a day-to-day basis was the introduction of social and ethics committees that really brought the ethics conversation into the boardroom. Nowadays, if there's a board meeting, chances are very good that at least some of the time will be devoted to a conversation about ethics and ethical expectations of the board, and that ultimately translates into management attention and something being done so that you can report something substantially back to the governing body on ethics. Now, it is a bit of a irony what happened with the Social and Ethics Committee, because although the name ethics appears in the name of the committee, it never appears in its mandate. In other words, it's basically a social in terms of what is our impact on our environment committee, without focusing on organizational ethics and ethical culture inside organizations. And this is where King 4, which was the first of the King reports that came out after the publication of the new Companies Act and the requirement for social and ethics committees, where they made a recommendation that social and ethics committees should broaden their mandate to also include a focus on organizational ethics. Up to where we sit today, even with amendments to the Companies Act, it is still the case that there's no reference to ethics in the statutory mandate of the committee. But when I was still chairperson of the Social and Ethics Committee Forum of the Institute of Directors, we started an annual trend survey. And one of the things that we looked at is what is the aspects that social and ethics committees spend most of their time and attention on. And it just happened to be that despite the absence of organizational ethics have become the topic that gets the most attention, alongside with employee health, especially in the time of COVID, and also transformation. Those are the big items on the agenda of social and ethics committees.
Well, you see, that's actually encouraging, because if it is being attended to because you are statutory and mandated to do this, then it's a kind of a, tick the box. But if it's being done without actually you being forced to do, then it means it becomes part of the DNA of a company.
And that is exactly the reason why the King Committee, who publishes these King reports, has consistently asked that the reports should not be turned into law, because we want to get away of that compliance mentality where people just tick the box, because then you do the minimum to get away with something. But if you can see, but this makes sense and this can add value to our company or to our organization, then there's a totally different mindset, and you get mindful application and not mindless compliance. And that is really what we want to propagate.
Now, the media is full of reports about non-compliance. We have VBS Bank and all those
It sells the paper.
It sells, unfortunately. But it kind of gives you the idea, but that's what business is all about. But let's talk about why a business goes the unethical way. What are the biggest threats for a business to become something that is actually stealing people's money or providing services that are not really good and so on? What is the DNA of an unethical company?
It's normally personal greed. It's normally individuals. If you read the story of corporate scandals, which I read quite a lot about, it very often starts with the greed of an individual. But if you look specifically at the whole era of state capture, both 1.0 and the current 2.0 is still playing out, it comes down to conflicts of interest. Now, a conflict of interest is when you use your position for your own benefit and not for the benefit of the organization. If any organization appoint you, or you get appointed to the board of any company, the reason why you are there is to act in the best interest of the organization. And that is something that is recognized the world over. It's also written into our Companies Act. It's written in the King reports. It's used by courts in the so-called business judgment rule that courts apply to see if directors acted in the way that they are expected to do. So what happens when things go wrong is that people start using their positions not for the purpose for which they was appointed, but to extract gain for themselves or for their immediate families. And if you look at what happened in state capture, that is what happened. People were appointed on boards not with the idea that they should serve the best interest of that company, but to extract money for other networks on the outside. And that obviously and unfortunately is what causes companies to collapse. So I know blind loyalty is not a good thing, but there should be a certain amount of loyalty also when you are an employee of an organization or when you sit on the governing body of an organization. And that loyalty is to the organization and pursuing the best interest of that organization.
Something is happening right now. Across every boardroom, every bank, every small business, every institution on this continent, the rules are changing. Artificial intelligence isn't coming. It's already here. And the question isn't whether it will reshape your industry. The question is, will you be the one leading that change? Most leaders know AI matters, but knowing it matters and knowing what to do about it, that's a very different thing. The gap between those who understand AI and those who don't is becoming the most dangerous gap in business today. Introducing AI for Leaders, a 6-session short learning program developed by the Institute for Technology Strategy and Innovation in partnership with NWU Business School. Designed for leaders and entrepreneurs across Africa, practical, focused, immediately applicable. Over 12 weeks, you'll go from understanding the foundations of AI to mastering prompt engineering, the art of getting AI to do exactly what you need, to using AI to supercharge your personal productivity in tools you already use every day, to exploring the cutting edge, agents that work autonomously, making decisions, executing tasks, and transforming your business processes while you focus on strategy. You'll learn from world-class facilitators, engineers, professors, entrepreneurs, and journalists who live at the intersection of technology and business. Guest lecturers at Cornell, Northwestern, and Cambridge University. Practitioners who have shaped the conversation on AI across Africa and beyond. Complete the program, and you won't just have a certificate registered with Northwest University. You'll have the confidence, the language, and the strategy to lead AI adoption in your organization. And because this program qualifies under the Skills Development Levy, your company can fund it as part of your training spend. The leaders who will define Africa's digital future are learning right now. The only question left is, are you one of them?
Well, you mentioned state capture. Now, immediately, that's one part of the coin is the business that is unethical, but there's a political component to that as well. And it seems to me that's also what we read about all the time, that the politicians are not actually ethical. And when you described how ethics in a company works, it starts with the people at the top, and then the structures, and then someone who's actually driving this. And now it seems to me the fish rots from the head. Now, is that what's happening in politics in South Africa?
I'm afraid it does. Of course, that's also the title of a very famous book in corporate governance by Bob Garrett, The Fish Rots from Their Head. But the opposite is also true. If you want to get to an ethical culture, it also starts at the head. And that is why tone at the top is so important. But I think we should be careful, especially in South Africa, of how we perceive ethics in organizations, because there are two stories. The one is the story about ethics in business. The other one is the story about ethics in government. And a survey that I always follow on an annual basis, the Edelman Trust Barometer, which is released every year at the World Economic Forum in Davos, makes an annual assessment of the trust that people have in government, in business, in media, in civil society, organizations, and the like. And there are two very different stories when it comes to South Africa. When it comes to trust in business in South Africa, and let's say immediately, there's a direct correlation between ethics and trust. We don't trust crooks. We trust people who are honest and who we can rely on. People who keep their promises. When it comes to that, the Edelman's Trust Barometer indicates that trust in business is on par with the world average of, I think, the 33 countries who participate in that annual survey. And in the last one, it was even slightly higher than the world average. While when it comes to trust in government, we are right at the bottom, way below the world average. And unfortunately, these two are not planets who never cross each other. As you sort of suggested, when there's corruption, there's a corrupter and a corruptee. Very often we simply just assume that it always starts with the public servant or with the government official. It's not true. Very often it's the other way around. Same with bribery. There's a bribor and a bribee. And once again, it's not clear who sits on which side. But the big difference is, in the private sector, when there's a scandal, In other words, when unethical behavior is exposed, they are forced by market forces to act as swiftly as possible. Otherwise, they won't survive. And therefore, you can see there's normally immediate reaction. There's dismissal of the people who were involved. You bring in fresh leadership. You make all types of commitments to reassure people that what led to the scandal would not easily reoccur in future. Of course, infallibility is a myth. There will always be failures. So if anyone who believes we will ever come to a point where there are no failures are living in some strange world. While in the case of government and also state-owned enterprises, they can get away with poor performance and unethical behavior because they are bailed out all the time. They don't have to perform themselves out of that situation. And I think that is the most obvious explanation for why we see such a huge difference between perceptions of trust in business and perceptions of trust in government.
Now, it seems to me you have quite a big impact and influence in business. Now, are there similar structures or influences in, say, for instance, local government, where ethics are is being taught there, or in political structures, or is there something like that?
Yeah. There are. On the one hand, you have your public service regulations. And your public service regulations determines that each department on both national and provincial level, please note not local government level, must have an ethics officer. In other words, they must have a full-time ethics manager in that department. And then there are also certain prescriptions on what they should do, but also what the head of the department should do, and also what they should report to the oversight bodies when it comes to ethics. So the words are there on paper, and to be honest, in certain state departments it really works, in others it doesn't. In local government we don't have exactly that same thing, although the legislation that deals with local government also refers to ethics. But at the Ethics Institute, we started an initiative that we call the Local Government Ethical Leadership Initiative, where we developed a code very similar to what we learned from the King Codes and the fact that they had impact. Also certain principles that local government leaders, and there I mean both in the council, but also in the administrative part, that they should adhere to. And we've seen some good traction there with quite a number of municipalities who now already adopted that code for ethical leadership in local government. So it's still early days, it's a young initiative, but we are starting to see traction there. And it's really important that we are able to not only be effective with our ethics management in the private sector, but also in the government sector.
Well, that's good news, but it seems to me it depends on, firstly, a political will to attend to that and not kill the people who are actually do that, and also kind of a culture. Now, do you think there are kind of cultural differences in attendance or adherence to ethic principles?
There clearly are cultural differences, but there are also fundamentals that goes across cultures. You can speak to anyone in any culture and they would always put a high priority on honesty, on fairness, and on respect, which are three absolutely core fundamental ethical values. Yes, people prioritize them differently. In some cultures, respect is much more important than fairness, for example. Or loyalty is much more important than honesty. So obviously you get the case, although we all subscribe to the same ethical values, we prioritize them differently. So those differences are there. But if you go back to those values, you have an audience, because people intuitively understand what you are talking about. And if you talk about living meaningful lives and the role that ethics plays in living a life of dignity and a life of meaning, people understand that and they connect with that. So in that sense, I never found it difficult to talk about ethics across cultural boundaries, and people do understand it. And also if you appeal to the African moral philosophy of Ubuntu, exactly those values of interconnectedness, of caring, of solidarity, it all forms part of that value system.
Now, from my field of expertise about the brain and so on, you always have this universal foundation, which are shared across all cultures, and then you've got specific, culturally specific superstructures that, and that's where the differences are. But the basics are all the same, and it's interesting where you can see that is true is how children play. When children play, there's always this whole thing about fairness.
And you even get it in animals. There are very interesting experiments regarding treating animals differently, in other words, discriminating, and to see that there's even in animals huge frustrations and anger when that type of thing happens.
All right, so if you have a kind of a dream for South Africa in terms of ethics in the next decade, what would that be?
What we need is a whole ecosystem. There's not one single player that can turn it around. But let me first start by saying I always insist that the future is not the extension of the present. And so often one sees that people expect, they see things now and they simply expect it will continue along those lines. That is simply not true. We just need to look at apartheid and where we are now to see that fundamental change can happen. But what I would like to see is a whole ecosystem where we start already in schools, not so much to teach ethics in schools. I have deep reservations about that. But to run schools as moral communities where we talk about our values, to have the same also continued in academic life for students, but also for academics, to play their role in preparing this new generation for what is the role of us as individuals, but also of organizations in building a sustainable planet. Because that really is where we are now. We are sitting at a point where we can destroy life on Earth. And therefore we need to understand what are the responsibilities. But then, of course, it is for political leaders to show that will that you refer to. For your private sector leaders, for your watchdog organizations, for your media, for your civil society, all of them understanding that we are co-responsible for the future of our society and for the future of our children. And it's that type of commitment that I would like to see. And then probably the one thing that we should get away from is by focusing on what we don't want, because we spend too much time on fighting the demons instead of working towards a more responsible society.
Well, that's amazing, but I want you just to come back to become very, very, very practical about how do you think what you envisage now for schools? If it's not to be taught, but there must be a kind of an ecosystem, what needs to be done to let that happen in a school?
It's basically applying that governance of ethics framework that we spoke about, that you start with leadership commitment. And you get your leadership commitment in your school leaders, amongst your pupils, your teaching staff, but also your governing body, your school governing body. And then making them co-responsible for identifying the values by which we should live, but ultimately the culture that we should create in our school environment. And the reason why I'm skeptical about teaching ethics in schools, if everything is unethical in the school, and now this alien arises here and tells us to be ethical, the only outcome will be cynicism. It's not a credible message. But if you can demonstrate that it can be lived, and if you look at schools that have been turned around, you would see it starts with a leader who says, we can't tolerate this any longer. Here's a new value system. We make the parents, the teachers, the pupils in the school responsible for that, and you basically form a moral community in a school, and that teach people lifelong lessons about how do you run sustainable organizations.
Well, it almost sounds like your personal history, because you had this interdisciplinary or broad interest in solid, good theoretical foundation. It was linked to your student activities, where you came into contact with the real questions of society, and then you all the time balanced theory with practice and theory with practice. I don't see you in an ivory tower ever. I don't think there's one big enough to keep you there. So, Deon, it was absolutely stunning to talk to you, and I wish you all the best, and I wish South Africa, the whole of South Africa, and especially the politicians, to take heed of your very good advice and practical, theoretically based practical ways that we should run our country.
Thank you. It was a big privilege for me.
And that was a podcast about, and a talk to Professor Deon Rousseau about ethics and ethics in South Africa. See you next time. If you are involved in research that you would like to share with the rest of the world, please contact us on knowledgehub@blue-marble.co.za.